Excellent. Cool. Yeah. So again, my name is Nate Dunn, and I'm from Data Driven Athlete. Happy to be here this morning. We'll try and get through some of these a little bit quicker since we had a little bit of a late start. But this morning we'll be talking about strengths and weaknesses and how to use your data to kind of drill down into some of these areas. So next slide, please. So we'll be looking at two primary ways to identify your strengths and weaknesses using your data. The first one, and the one we'll be spending the most time on, is the Training Peaks Power Profile Chart. So most of you are familiar with what this looks like, and we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of learning what types of insights you can gather from that. The second one is a little bit newer and a little bit more complex, but we'll show it here just briefly, is the WKO4 Power Duration Curve. And we'll kind of demonstrate how those are getting at their or are eventually displaying the same type of feedback that you can use in your writing. So why do we care about any of these power profile charts or identifying our strengths and weaknesses? And the first question is that the first answer to that is that you might not really care. So some of these tools, they might be beneficial to you, they might not be beneficial to you. So it's important that when you look at these different charts, that oftentimes compare you against other, against other writers, or specifically against other categorized writers. That it's not the the be all and end all of what you can be or what you could be as a cyclist. So it's important to kind of put that disclaimer out there first before we jump in. So next slide, please. So these are just tools, right? And these are tools that depend on good data. So if your power meter is inaccurate, or if you have significant power spikes to your data, or if you had a day that you're on Zwift where your power meter wasn't reading accurately and it threw your power off considerably, those are the types of mistakes in your data that will render a power profile chart like this pretty much useless. So before you try and gather any insight from these charts, it's important to make sure that you're feeding it with good data. And like we mentioned before, it might be meaningful, it might not. These don't define your chance for success. So oftentimes what people do is they'll strip the categorized ratings off of this power profile chart. So if you're a person that really kind of gets wigged out by comparing yourself to other people, then it's more useful to kind of take out that measuring system and maybe just look at it to get a clear picture of who you are as a cyclist. And we'll jump into that here as we progress. So next slide, please. So a power profile chart is really the primary purpose of it is to kind of show us our strengths and our weaknesses across different physiological areas of our fitness spectrum, right? So this is again from the power profile chart that you'll find in Training Peaks. I've cleaned it up a little bit to kind of highlight some of these things, but on the left, or on the vertical axis, you'll have kind of the categorized ratings, and on the bottom, we have our power duration, or we have different durations of power. So the first one, right, sprint power, 5 second, that really defines kind of our abilities at the neuromuscular level. And then moving to the right, then we have our kind of anaerobic capacity, so classic duration that gives us some insight in our anaerobic capacity on the bike. So 1 minute anaerobic capacity, 5 minutes, kind of power at VO2 max range, and then continue to move towards the right, 20 minutes. That classic measure of our fitness at lactate threshold, or FTP. And then moving further over to 60 minutes, still looking at our power at lactate threshold, but moving more into kind of our endurance and our fatigue resistance. So these are the main kind of variables that a power profile chart is highlighting, and then we're going to jump into kind of how those can impact your writing next. So next slide, please. So power profile chart really, the other way that it, not only does it kind of help us identify our strengths and weaknesses, but it can also kind of give you an idea of the type of writer that you might be, or the type of writer that you are right now, maybe before doing further training. And really what it highlights is 3 types, and that's a sprinter, a time trialist, and an all-rounder. So we're going to take a look at different power profile charts of those different types of riders to kind of help you more clearly identify what that shape looks like. So in the next slide, we see really a classic power profile trend of what a sprinter is. So pretty intuitive here, right? On the left-hand side, or looking at that neuromuscular range of fitness, we see that this rider is very high in that range, in that 5 second range. And then we see a downward sloping trend as we progress out towards the 60-minute, or kind of towards the endurance range. So this is a very classic look at what a typical sprinter looks like, who's going to excel in criteriums, or the main way that they're going to be successful in races is going to be to hide most of the race, conserve, and then pop out in the last 300 meters, 200 meters, 100 meters And that's going to be the way that they're going to experience the most success. So if this is you, and we'll get into this a little bit further, but that can help kind of define what some of your tactics might be. So the next slide, we have a classic power profile trend of what a time trialist looks like. So comparably, you can see there in the 5-second range, they're very weak at sprinting. So their neuromuscular power isn't very good. Their anaerobic capacity isn't very good either. But then we see them much higher kind of in that VO2 max range, power at lactate threshold, or FTP, and then moving further out there into the 60-minute range. So this time trial, this is a classic look at what a time trialist looks like. And then again, we'll kind of get into what this might mean and how you might use, if this is you, kind of how this might shape some race tactics or training in the future. And so the last kind of look that we're going to look at, this is an all-rounder. So again, it makes sense. It's pretty intuitive where we see that this rider is pretty balanced across all areas. They're not a great sprinter, but they're not too bad. Anaerobic capacity is pretty decent. Their power at VO2 max is pretty good, and then as well as their FTP, or power at threshold, and then also extending out into their endurance. So looking, that's a couple different looks, perspectives on how the power profile chart looks. And then if we go to the next slide, and we're going to just give a brief example of kind of how the power duration curve in WKO4 kind of mirrors that same feedback that the power profile chart does, but it does it in a slightly different way. So how it does that is that we're looking at the intensity duration relationship to highlight strengths and weaknesses. So if we go to the next slide, we go back to the same rider. So we started with our sprinter, and we're going to go back to the same rider so you can kind of get that image in your head of what a sprinter profile looks like using the power profile chart and Training Peaks. And then the next slide, now we have this picture of this same exact data, but using the power duration model in WKO4. So a little bit more complex, but it also gives us greater granularity to kind of mouse over these different areas and see where the direct strengths and weaknesses are of this rider, not just in the individual chunks of 5-second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, 60 minute, but really any duration along that whole power duration curve. So you can see we have marked up here in this graph a little bit that the vertical axis is intensity normalized for weight. So we have watts per kg is what we're using on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we have duration. So similar type data that's being displayed, just done in a little bit different way. So if you have WKO4, or if you're accustomed to this view, some people kind of prefer this view. I actually prefer the Training Peaks power profile chart. I think it's a more powerful representation and kind of helps filter out some of the noise. But both of these are really excellent tools for that initial perspective of what your strengths and weaknesses are. So next slide, please. So we've looked at these different perspectives on your power. So what, right? So we kind of get back to this original question that we started the presentation with. Why is this important? And the first one is it can help to provide context for our goals. It can inform our race tactics. And then the third one is it can help to guide our training decisions to an extent. So we're going to go to the next slide, and as we look at this power profile chart, we're going to talk about how we would do that. So in terms of goal setting, a power profile chart can be a really helpful reality check when you're establishing your goals. So if you're starting out the beginning of the year, or if you're getting ready for cross season maybe coming up, or even if you have some goals on Zwift in terms of riding with better groups, this can really help to set those and to say, is this a realistic goal? So if your goal is to win a state criterium championship, and if your neuromuscular power is comparably pretty weak to the rest of your power outputs, then that might not be the best goal for you to set. Now, it might not mean that that's not still an accomplishable goal, but it might be that another goal, if you're a time trialist, might be a time trial championship or something like that. So kind of working off that in terms of helping to establish realistic goals, it can also help to establish realistic tactics. So let's go back to that original goal, and let's say you're a time trialist, but let's say you really want to win the state criterium championship. Well, obviously you can see we have a disconnect here. Whereas the best, the most common way that criteriums are won are in bunch, in sprint finishes at the finish of a race. So kind of taking that information into account, if you're a time trialist, then you're going to have to win this race in a different fashion. You're not going to be able to outsprint anybody. The only way likely that you're going to be winning this, the state criterium championship is if you initiate a breakaway and maybe you whittle down the number of people that you're sprinting against, or if you go on a solo break, maybe with 15, 20 minutes left in the criterium, and you try and catch people off guard. So not only can it help to refine our goals, but it can also help to further to help us further specify what our tactics might be in a race, kind of using this information and saying, hey, if I want to win a race, if my goal is to really win a race, this power profile chart can give me a lot of good information to say, realistically, this is not a strength of mine. So I have to turn the race. I have to create the race or create opportunities within the race for myself that are going to highlight my strengths. And oftentimes I see riders who they want to win a race in a certain fashion, and they continue to fail at winning the race in that fashion because they're not lining up what their strengths are with the reality of how to win this specific race that they're interested in. So setting your goals, kind of refining your tactics can be a big help here. This is where the WKO4 power duration model can be more helpful, I would say, in tactics, because not just are we looking at 5-second sprint power, which is kind of that finishing 100 meters in a criterion, but we can kind of expand that out to say, well, what about a longer sprint, or what about an attack? It may be 7 minutes to go in a criterium or whatever. So you can kind of refine your tactics in a much more granular sense using that WKO4 power duration model. So whatever you use, whether or not it's that or this power profile chart, it can help to better your tactics. So the last one in terms of training. So we moving back to the last slide, we talked about it can help guide your training decisions to an extent. And this is an important one where oftentimes people will look at a power profile chart like this and they'll say, well, I'm comparably very weak in my sprint power, like we're looking at with this power profile chart. So that means I need to do a lot of sprint work. And the reality is that a lot of the, in terms of our sprint work and our anaerobic capacity, the majority of those strengths are really baked into your genetics. So it might be that you can make, some small improvements in those areas, but to sell out your training in an effort to improve your 5-second sprint power, when let's say your power at VO2 max or your power at lactate threshold or FTP is much better, really doesn't add up in terms of being a good investment of your training time. So if we go to the next slide, we'll kind of come back to that concept here in a minute, but kind of the takeaway from most of this is that when you're using a power profile chart, it can be helpful in creating realistic goals, applying your strengths and weaknesses to your tactics, and then kind of moving back to that last point. Don't sell out your training. Don't sell out one area of your training just to improve a weakness that you have if that's not a significant strength of yours. And we can see that in our next slide here, where whether or not it's focusing on neuromuscular power or anaerobic capacity or VO2 max, the primary driver of your success on the bike is going to be time spent in improving your aerobic fitness or improving your FTP. So kind of going back to that last point in terms of helping to guide your training decisions, yes, it can help. That power profile chart can help to guide your training decisions to an extent. Your focus should still be on spending the majority of your time improving your aerobic fitness. And then once you've done that for a while, if you're going to come back and refine some of those weaknesses, then that's the time to do that. But don't sell out all of your training just to focus on what seem to be glaring weaknesses. I think the better investment is in spending that in improving your FTP. So we're all done for me. We can go to the last slide if there's any questions that you have, not just on this topic in terms of utilizing strengths and weaknesses, but any other training topics. You can feel free to fire away. I know we're running a little bit over here and we might be short on time, but you can fire away at will.
Cool. Thank you so much, Nate. We've got a couple comments here on Facebook to talk about. Adam Toledo says, "Hey, can you copy and paste that chart into my Training Peaks?" I think he wants to inherit the power profile chart you want.
Yeah, well, I would say most of us that don't have sprint power all wish that we had sprint power, because it's, for most of us, criterium racing is most racing that we do. And in all honesty, if you have really good sprint power, you're going to be more successful in winning bike races, at least initially, than most other people. So I feel your pain. My sprint power is anemic, and I've always wished that I could hit sprint numbers like that too. But it will never happen. Doesn't matter how much sprint work I do, it's not going to happen. So.
All right. So I want to talk about how that informed your decision at the World Transplant Games. But I have a question off the feed here from Taya that says, "Is it possible to change one's power profile over time with proper training? How much of it is genetics?"
Yeah, so I would say to an extent, and I don't know, Justin, if you can go back to the slide, but the slide that I would look at would be the time trialist power profile slide.
Okay.
Um, so in terms of changing your power profile, I would say to an extent. So I think that this is a good example here of in looking at this power profile chart of this time trialist, we could say that probably the areas that are underdeveloped with this cyclist are the cyclist's FTP or power in that 20-minute range, and then their power, extending out, or their endurance extending out into the 60-minute range. So those are the areas, really that give evidence of improved aerobic fitness. So for this athlete, we can see that their VO2 max is really strong. Like that area of about that 5-minute range is where they're best, and that probably if we're going to get improvements or changes to this power profile chart, that's where those changes are likely going to come from. So I would say definitely in filling out those indices of aerobic fitness, kind of in that 20-minute range, 60-minute range, even to some degree that 5-minute range, I would say that's where you're typically going to see changes to the shape of the power profile curve. But in general, this overall shape of the curve is really not going to change. You could be doing a ton of 5-second sprint work, and you might see some improvements in that area, but it's not going to alter the overall shape of your curve. So in terms of genetics, I'd be hesitant to give you a number there. There's an article on our website at Data Driven Athlete where we talk about genetic influence of things like VO2 max and trainability of that. But when it comes to sprint work and anaerobic capacity, that's pretty much what you get. Now you can improve your repeatability of those numbers, so your ability to sprint again and again and again, you can certainly improve that. But that doesn't show up in this power profile chart. This power profile chart isn't demonstrating repeatability. It's just showing you what those max numbers are. And in my experience, that 5-second, that 1-minute range really doesn't change a whole lot, regardless of the investment that you put in there.
Very good. Thank you. Very helpful. A question here from Omar Rivas. I'm 100 kilograms. My sprint power is great, but 20-minute and 60-minute is very weak. Do I keep training and lose weight, or keep improving FTP?
So I would say that's the classic. That's a great problem to have, right? If your sprint power is there, but if your FTP is low, that's kind of that's the power profile chart of possibility. Really, is that you've already got that explosive power that will eventually bring you some race wins. So really the work to be done is to improve your aerobic fitness and, like you mentioned, to lose weight. So if I was putting together a plan for you, that's exactly what I would prescribe. I would prescribe continuing to be smarter with your nutrition and lose weight, and investing the bulk of your time in improving your FTP, because your sprint power is always going to be there. It's not going to go away. It's only going to be further. You're only going to further be able to maximize it as your aerobic fitness gets better and better and better. So it's a great problem to have, to be a great sprinter and to have great sprint numbers, but to have comparably a very low FTP, because really what that shows is it basically gives you this question, and it says, how bad do you want it? The intangibles are there. So your ability to win bunch sprints are there. The rest of it is just, how bad do you want it? How hard do you want to work to improve your aerobic fitness? And to me, that's an exciting place to be as an athlete or as a coach, because it's up to you in terms of how hard you want to work for it, as opposed to someone else who maybe they've worked for years and years and years to develop their aerobic fitness, and they're experiencing frustration because they're not winning races, because they're getting out sprinted all the time because their sprint power is so low comparably.
Yeah. One comment I might make on that fact there, Omar, is that we say obviously building those two things, your FTP and losing weight, are going to help you make lots of improvement. I would say that you don't want to, it's not realistic to expect to be able to do both simultaneously. So you'll want to, maybe spend the bulk of winter when you're doing a lot of base, and basically that time, you focus on losing weight. And then as you get closer to the season, you start adding on specificity and higher power output. Then you focus on bringing up your FTP. Once you're no longer trying to lose weight. What would you say on that one there, Coach?
Yeah, I would say the warning is a good warning. And the overall warning is that it can be very difficult to make sure that you're adequately fueling your rides when you're consistently in a state of caloric deficit. So it's certainly not impossible, but it takes it takes much more careful planning to be in a caloric deficit, but to still fuel your rides and to make gains in fitness. So it's not impossible, but if you're new to cycling and if you're new to training in particular, I think that's a good warning to make, is that it's probably not wise to try and take on too many responsibilities at once while you're just getting started. It might make more sense to focus on one area of that. And the good thing is that even if you're just focusing on one area, you're going to get faster regardless. So you kind of have these multiple variables that you can play with that will improve your performance on the bike. You can lose weight, which is going to help you get faster, or you can improve your aerobic fitness, which is going to help you get faster. And ultimately, if you're consistent over time, I think you'll probably do both. You'll continue to lose weight and you'll continue to improve your aerobic fitness. So the time scale on how that works best is really up to you, and kind of what your overall commitment is to training and what you have available to you.
And the one that'll provide the most return probably depends on the individual situation as well. Somebody may be very, very well developed in their power. They've been training with power for a long time, and they've just recently let their weight get out of control. And in that case, it'd be a lot easier to tackle weight first, or only focus on weight. You might have the other end of the barrel where you're pretty lean, but you just need to develop the power. So that one, as to which one's more important, probably going to be individual. Kind of depends on your history and training as well, I would say.
Yeah, and weight is a really difficult one. It's in a lot of ways, it's much more difficult than improving your aerobic fitness, right? Because getting out on the bike and riding a bunch, for people that are motivated, it's not that hard. But then restricting your calories and changing what types of foods you eat and what time you eat them, it's a much larger discussion that involves your family and oftentimes cultural elements, in terms of what types of foods you eat. And so, weight, I would say losing weight is the largest, most difficult one to tackle. And I would say make sure that you're prepared to really give a go at it, because it can obviously be the hardest of those two projects.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up the live feed. Once again, thank you, Nate, so much for your time. Always great insights, great teaching. You guys can find more great content on his website and his blog, datadrivenathlete.com. They're on Facebook. They're on Twitter as well. Maybe, yes. Twitter, yes?
Yeah, sure. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of them.
And let's follow up with him. He's got lots of great content. You can reach out to him directly at nate@datadrivenathlete.com if you've got a specific question you want to ask. And also, if you have any suggestions or questions for the show, you can contact us at WUWP@teamodz.com. So we really appreciate you coming. Hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be here again next weekend. Apparently, my mind isn't caught up from all the tech difficulties at the beginning of the show. We're on Wednesdays. We're not on the weekend. It does start with a W. I got that part right. But so here you go. Next Wednesday, 6:30 a.m. Hope to have you back, and hope you enjoyed the show, guys. Have a wonderful day.